Andrew Baker works in a variety of mediums. He is a composer, writer, and filmmaker. But despite the variety of mediums, there seems to be a unity of ideas in his work. He has kindly agreed to be interviewed by me. I decided to start with the theological underpinnings of his work. Andrew has written a book of his personal Platonic Franciscan theology, Dancing with God. So can you outline the basic ideas you have in the relationship of God to nature?
That's a really big question, so I'll try and answer it as simply as I can. And I'm not really a theologian. I wrote that little book, which is on my website, really to put down my own thoughts, and it's very much about music. It's a musician's point of view, because I think that the idea of music and writing music, listening to music, performing music, is a very good way of understanding our relationship with nature as a whole and creation. So I tend to think like that. But to think about some actual clear theological point which lies behind everything I do isn't that easy, but I think I can pretty well pinpoint what the common denominator is behind all these different things. And this is explained by a man called Joseph Milne, who's written some very good short books about theology and the changes of ideas of creation in the Middle Ages. And he defines two different traditions within Christianity and in other religions as well as being creationism and emanationism. But by creationism, he doesn't mean the belief, literal belief in creation as in the Bible against evolution. What he means is creationism is the idea that God, whatever you want God to be, made the world. Here's the thing, it's made. Whereas emanationism is the idea that everything flows from God, it emanates from God like a projection. And the easiest analogy is to imagine everything is flowing like light from a single source but breaking into many colors. Well, that's the Platonic way of seeing it. And I think he's right in saying these are two quite distinct traditions. And obviously I tend to go on the emanation thing, because if everything is flowing from that source of being, we are part of that too. We're within it. So everything is a performance, and we're not separable from that overall performance. And we have the same harmonies within us. So that's a very, very simple way of looking at it. But I think what I find very fascinating is that the emanation view pretty well evaporates in the 13th century. It's very, very ancient. It goes through the early church, and it comes to a climax with St. Francis and Bonaventure particularly. But then it very rapidly goes away, and you get theology in the West being influenced by Aristotle, where everything's much more analytical. And this is the time when people start losing what Owen Barfield called participation.
So how does this relate to your ideas of spirit of place?
Well, yes, well, this is where we can forget all this, my slightly hazy theology, and get back to actual experience, because everything I do is really goes back to experience. And over all my life, I've been trying to find some language that explains how the world seems to be to me. Might not be like this to other people. And I can think when I was very, very young, we used to have holidays with my grandmother in Eastbourne on the south coast of England. And she lived in a 1930s nice detached house up an ordinary street with buses going by, and the bus would take you down to the seaside. And I'm talking about the 1950s here, and incredibly. But if you walked up her street, you got to what they call a twitten, a little passage between the houses, and you went through that little twitten, and you came out into a wood. And that wood was on the edge of the South Downs. You walked up through the wood, and before you knew where you were up on this green hills with ancient burial mounds. And you were saying, And my father would be saying these paths were made by Stone Age men. And so suddenly you've gone out of this very ordinary little street into this world of ancient things, and suddenly it all seems mysterious. So that was when I was very, very young. And then, so the idea of places having meaning was there from an early age. Why is this? Mystery of it. And I think to put it into clear ideas, the big influence was living in Bedford, where I lived from when I was born to when I was 14. It's the hometown of John Bunyan. And Bunyan, writer of the Pilgrim's Progress, was a Baptist and a Calvinist. And really, on the face of it, all the kinds of things I don't really go for myself. I'm not very keen on this predestination and all that. But anyway, the Pilgrim's Progress is a story of people traveling to try and escape this world and find the heavenly kingdom and escape from sin. But when we moved into the countryside near Bedford, I got very excited by the fact that these villages and the river were places he walked. Bunyan would walk down the river and baptize people in the river and preach in those places, probably not in the churches, he wasn't allowed to, preach in the fields. And there was the idea in the countryside that the Pilgrim's Progress is happening around the real landscape. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, this becomes an incredibly exciting idea, because it means, I don't think Bunyan would have thought of this at all, though he might have felt it. In the book, you're trying to escape this world. But in the countryside, you walk those paths and fields as if you are on that journey. And so everything in the real fields is the symbolic journey towards heaven. Uh-huh. And that is so exciting. And the critical thing for me is, when I'm a teenager, this is completely tied up with musical ideas, because there's musical versions of the Pilgrim's Progress, particularly Vaughan Williams' Fifth Symphony, which was hugely influential. So in my mind as a teenager, here are the paths through the villages and along the river, osier beds, reed beds where he used to baptize. But then there's the music going on in my head, which is part of the same world. So very clearly, it's the world is this experience that has meaning of this sort, and the music is all part of it. There's no, in my head, I'm saying the music I'm listening to is as much part of that world, that creation, as the bass is. And I remember saying that to someone, probably when I was at school, who was saying about listening to music for escapism. And I remember saying, well, why is that music any less real than that block of flats? It's part of the same world. Right. I'm sorry I'm going on a lot about this, but this is all relevant because it's saying this is actually experience. If you think about it, in the 70s, I'm getting into my early 20s, and I have these ideas in my head, the Bunyan and the places already having meaning and the music. And then I know I got very distracted by this whole 70s ancient mysteries world, people like Jean Michel and ley lines. And it's like you're looking in a kind of materialistic way for something in the landscape that's ancient and mysterious. But I very quickly got over that, because I knew that if I'm going through that walk, the things that really sing and have meaning might not be ancient stones or strange alignments. It might be some rusting farm machinery, or something that a person you meet, or something happens, or a more recent story. It's not to do with the past. All these things are part of one world. So I've got out of that ancient past thing. Then I would say pinpoint another critical moment was a TV film in 1974 or 5, might be in 5, called Penda's Fen by David Rudkin. You can find it on YouTube, BBC. And this is one of the things that crystallized ideas, because 2 years before, I'd been on a summer music school. I don't play any instrument properly, but I went on this summer music school for students to learn conducting. And it was a hot summer somewhere in Sussex. And the main thing we did throughout the 2 weeks was perform Elgar's Dream of Grontius. And we ended up performing this work in this very Anglo-Catholic decorated chapel, because it was all happening in an old public school, Urswinsue College. And it was an overwhelming emotional experience with all this going on in the summer 1973. In the 1975 film Penda's Fen, the story is about a sort of teenage boy having all kinds of typical problems of teenage boy, and he's wandering around the Malvern Hills in England, which is where Elgar lived. He's listening to the Dream of Grontius as some great mystical thing, and then at the same time he's wandering around these ancient places on the hills and having encounters with the pagan king Penda and the ghost of Elgar, and also the crazy writer David Rudkin puts in another layer where there's a kind of science fiction element of weird sort of military things going on underground, as if there's some secret establishment underground. It has the contemporary science fiction Elgar and the Ancient. And so watching this is, well, yes, of course, that's what it's like. I know all this. and so it was all, so everything in it was something I already knew about. So that's 1975. So in other words, my fate is sealed by 1975. So my particular thing is to look at the world in places in particular with music, just look at it, say, look at this as a whole, see what there is. Almost anything can have meaning this month. I have all these ideas. Then I get distracted again because I get involved in the mystery of Rennes-le-Château from 1974-6 kind of time, which is this great mystery about supposedly secret treasure in a French village and all these strange goings on, which became famous afterwards with the Da Vinci Code, which took all the ideas from the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which was published in 1982. But anyway, I got very keen on this weird mystery. It was all, this is some real mystery about a real village. And by 1980, I went on a trip to this place in France. And it was a bit of a conflict because there's all this searching for some historical mystery. But at the same time, I'm thinking, yes, but really, it's just a wonderful place. You can't pin it down to something literal. And I got to know Henry Lincoln, who led that tour in 1980 and was responsible for TV films about it and the books, Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And he was a bit of a guru, and he wasn't laying down the law. He was asking all these questions, and it was very, very interesting. And not long after, I met Richard Lee, who was one of the co-authors, and Michael Bagent. They wrote that. Got to know them all, who wrote the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And so I'd be arguing all these things. And I remember another key moment in life, sitting having lunch with Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln somewhere in Hampstead. I couldn't say exactly where. And I was saying to Richard Lee, how do you show people that the world doesn't follow what we think of as material cause and effect? It all has meaning in it. And Richard Lee said, oh, well, that's an epistemological question. He said, all you can do is say lo. Okay, so I'm up to the early 80s. And then, I suppose, we get onto what I'm doing now, which is the Chhabra thing. Recently, and I mean over the last 30 years, I've been very involved with Chhabra, which is in Staffordshire, which is where I now live. And I first got to know about this place through Henry Lincoln, Richard Lee, and Michael Bagent and their mystery of Rennes-le-Château, because that mystery is all very much tied up with Poussin and Poussin's painting The Shepherds of Arcadia. And it just happens that at Chhabra, there's a very strange monument that has a marble carving based on that picture with an unsolved cipher inscription. This is so weird that it should be that picture with some weird cryptic inscription. And so those people investigating Rennes-le-Château suggested Chhabra was to do with that mystery. So I knew about it from that. And then in 1982, I got a job working for Staffordshire Libraries as music librarian. I'd never been to Staffordshire before I went for the interview. And lo and behold, I found myself living in what had been an estate cottage on the Chhabra estate. So I was living in Chhabra Cottages, Little Haywood. It was an old estate cottage. So I got to know the place very, very well. And so I then with the help of Michael Bagent, who gave me all his historical material about 18th century England, esoteric stuff, I did what research I could do. And it was all a bit of a distraction. I got to know about the landscape of the place, but it was all tied up with this crazy mystery. And I have to say, by 1990, it was quite obvious that the whole of the Rennes-le-Château thing was a hoax. People don't like to believe this now, but it's not only a hoax, it's a very bad hoax. It's clever in that it's a hoax that links together all kinds of unrelated true things, but they don't actually connect. There isn't any connection with Poussin and Rennes-le-Château. There wasn't a treasure, etc., etc. There's no secret society called the Priory of Zion. It was this very crazy man, Pierre Plantard, and his friend Philippe de Cherizet, who was an alcoholic comedian. They don't like to tell you he was a comedian and writer of surrealist radio shows, but they together cooked up the whole mystery in the 70s, 60s, 70s. It all collapsed, but I learnt a lot. So then here I am at Chhabra. It's still strange. There's still a monument with a mysterious inscription. So after the years go by, and after 2000, I started to do it seriously, because this became a focal point. There is something very special about that particular landscape. It is a real place that has all these themes of Arcadia and the Golden Age through the monument, through literary connections, in a very unusual way. And sometime around 2005-06, I met a proper historian, Kerry Bristol, who was researching the Greek revival architect James Stewart, and she had written an article saying that Thomas Anson of Chhabra, who had built up the estate in the 18th century, had actually been a secret patron of the arts, and really he is the patron driving Greek revival architecture. So Stewart, the architect, became a big influential figure on authentic Greek style in the late 18th century. But Thomas Anson at Chhabra was really his patron, the eminence grise, but it isn't obvious. Though Stewart built monuments at Chhabra. So I thought, no, actually, there's something more at Chhabra. This man, Thomas Anson, is a really fascinating figure who really did have an influence in that kind of world. And at the same time, I start saying, but this place has this quality anyway. It's a secluded valley. It's like a locus amenus, which is like it's a comfortable, separate world. And it's separated from the rest of the world, even though it has a canal and two mainline railways running through it. You go there and you feel you're in a different place. You come down the road into the valley and it's separate. I think aesthetically or symbolically, a key thing is it's the confluence of two rivers. The River Trent and the River Sal meet there, and the house is at the point where the rivers meet. And I think that even if the landscape with the buildings wasn't there, it would still be an Arcadian landscape. This point where the rivers meet, below a wild forest, Cannock Chase, which is a big wilderness. And so that's why in that particular film, I moved from saying this is history, and there are ideas there, but it's also the landscape itself you can look at has qualities which are much more peculiar, and they really are archetypal landscape themes. And it goes beyond historical fact when you start noticing other literary connections in the same area. Like Tolkien and his wife was living in the village next to Chhabra, so he would walk through there, and he wrote his first Middle-earth stories in the village next to Chhabra, Great Haywood. An Elizabethan house, Tixall Hall, of which only the gatehouse remains. Walter Aston, who lived there, was patron of Elizabethan poets and Jacobean poets. And not far away is Chartley Castle, where Philip Sidney met his muse, Penelope Devereux, who's stellar. So you've got a connection with Sidney and the Arcadian thing. It's just something about that place. So I'm going to read you something now. And if you think about the 18th century, particularly in England, it's all over-rational. They're all obsessed with Newton, who was a good bloke. Newton was looking for deep truths. But you've got this idea of everything mechanical, God separate. And so the world is totally detached. You've got the Industrial Revolution beginning, so people are worried, some people are worried about that, exploiting nature. And a very small number of people don't like that. They want to say, we don't like this. We want to say everything is divine and God does speak through nature. Hardly anyone. And they're all connected with the Chhabra social set. There's a man called James Harris, who Thomas Anson knew, who was a Platonic philosopher when it wasn't popular at all. But the wonderful forgotten character is a man called Floyer Sydenham, and he's delightful. He was a penniless scholar, but he was a great friend of this other man, James Harris, who was a well-off MP and also musician. And James Harris gave Sydenham money to help him translate Plato. The whole point of this was to fight materialism, and they really hated Locke, because I think particularly Locke didn't believe in innate ideas. He didn't believe that we had this sort of harmony and rule law within us, though he felt you could learn it from experience. He wasn't that awful. But Locke also has things where he's implying that it is up to us to exploit nature. Nature is there for us to exploit. And apparently this became a big influence in America. Here, Floyer Sydenham is this lovely man translating Plato, and at the same time as they're building Greek follies in their estates, where you can sit in a folly and look at beauties of nature, Sydenham translated Plato's Io. And I found this I have here, I found a first edition of this, 1759, Sydenham's translation of Plato's Io. It's even signed by him. He says, talking about inspiration, for they assure us that out of certain gardens and flowery vales belonging to the Muses, from fountains flowing there with honey, gathering the sweetness of their songs, they bring it to us like the bees, that is poets, and in the same manner withal, flying. Nor do they tell us any untruth, for a poet is a thing light and volatile and sacred. And I just love it. It's certain flowery vales belonging to the Muses. And that's the idea. Somewhere like Chhabra, or one of these 18th century gardens, is like that. It's a flowery vale where all the Muses are there in harmony. So the 18th century is good. I think the problem with it is that this philosophy of the Platonists in the 18th century is very abstract. It's all to do with abstract ideas forming things. It doesn't tell you how you become part of it. The real thing is that it's human. You've got to have the human element. You've got to know actually you know this through being human. And that's why I tend to be drawn to the Christian version, particularly people like Bonaventure and the few later people who have the same ideas like Thomas Traherne. And then some of the Jesuit writers, Teilhard de Chardin, and they're influenced by Bonaventure and the Franciscans. It's all about the fact that, no, you've got to be human. This is the Christian thing. It's the Christ thing. It's not just the abstract word. It's actually also Christ that is human. We relate to it by being what we are. And I think that's such a good idea. I have a lot of trouble following Christian ideas in the usual way. Here are stories in the Bible. You learn from this. I've never really got on with this because I'm not really being brought up with that in my head. But if you believe that everything emanates from God and has meaning in it, if you make yourself part of that and get to know that meaning speaking through all the light and dark of creation, you're actually learning the same thing as you are through the Christian story, through the Gospels, trying to be Christ-like Francis was. The end result, you are learning that the word is speaking to you through everything into you. You're becoming the same thing as you would if you're doing it through the usual Ignatian exercises through the Christian story. So it doesn't actually matter about what words you use in the religious language, because it's actually about something which is true for everybody. So I'm very happy to believe that the same idea of learning through creation in that sense is also common to other religions. They're just using different words. Mm-hmm. So in little films where there aren't any words, there's just some music. Talking about it, I realize that I've actually been following an incredibly clear and even obsessive story, and it's only recently that I've found a way of doing something with it because of the music, learning music, making films. It's a little way of actually making something of this. For years and years, I didn't know how I could do it, and but I do keep it separate. So when I've written about Thomas Hampson of Chhabra, I've written very, very strict history. Um, and I've discovered the more you stick to the facts when you're doing the history, it was by being ruthlessly factual that I found far more material historical.
Mm-hmm.
I found lots of new stuff, which was much more like the kind of my fantasies. So
Mm.
that's the way it goes. I'm not imposing fantasy on the world. I'm actually saying, no, actually look at it clearly. And I'll say one last thing.
Yeah.
That little film, because I know you're very keen on Steiner,
Yeah.
and I don't know very much about Steiner. And but I know what I get is that Owen Barfield, who I've read a bit of, obviously learned a lot from Steiner, and I'm getting increasingly convinced C.S. Lewis is actually heavily influenced by
Mm.
Steiner through Garfield.
Right.
You know, it's the same
Yes.
because C.S. Lewis is very much these ideas, and that hideous strength is very much about the kind of materialist thing against the emanationist spiritual view of the world. And all through the Narnia things, it's all about this participation thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all those ideas are there. It's very much his point of view. So it is something, and it means that you get people in the later Middle Ages, Renaissance people, who are actually thinking about God in a very different way from anyone before. And Joseph Milne, who I talked about writing about emanationism and creationism, he did a very good talk about this, and he said about Saint Thomas Aquinas and Luther having this idea of no, the goodness and beauty of the world is not the same as God's beauty and truth, whereas before they wouldn't have seen a difference. And Joseph Milne said, "This is the point where they invented the God atheists don't believe in."
Mm-hmm.
And people don't realize that they're actually following a
Mm.
completely different idea of God to what they were thinking before that.
Thank you for the interview, Andrew, and I hope you have all enjoyed watching it.